The first sound was not the wind, nor the distant hope of a Christmas bell, but a scream. It was thin, high, and broke like a wire snapping under too much strain. As winter tightened its grip on the valley, the sound came again, carried ragged on the frozen air. Another sound joined it, the dull slap of fists striking flesh and the coarse laughter of men who believed themselves untouchable. Snow muffled much in the valley, but it could not muffle cruelty. Arthur had been sharpening a blade when the sound reached him. He froze mid-draw, steel held still against a wet stone, listening. For months, he had lived alone in his ranch house, tucked against the slope with nothing but his own breath and the crack of pine for company. His life was pared down to meat, fire, and silence. But that scream tore through his walls and into his marrow. He pushed the knife aside, a scar on his jaw tightening with emotion, and rose. He was halfway to the door when a frantic pounding rattled it, too light to be a man's fists. Arthur swung it open, and a child all but fell inside. A Chinese girl, maybe 10 at most, her face flushed raw from the cold, her hair tangled with snowmelt. Her small hands clutched at his coat like claws. "They're beating her," she gasped, her chest hitching with sobs. "My mama." "They're hurting her, of course she's Chinese." Her words caught on her own fear, then came tumbling out in a rush. "You got to save her. You got to marry her, so they stop. Please." For a long moment, Arthur only looked at her. His eyes were dark, unreadable beneath a heavy brow, the face of a man long used to quiet, not please. But the girl's grip would not let him retreat into silence. He could feel the tremor of her hands, the damp of her tears soaking his shirt. When she raised her face to him, eyes wide with both terror and stubborn hope, it cut through something calcified inside him. He did not speak. He only reached for his rifle. The girl stumbled after him as he stepped into the storm. The snow stung, driven sideways by the wind, sharp as needles against the skin. Arthur followed the child's small figure as she led him down through the timber. The closer they drew to the settlement's edge, the clearer the sounds became, shouts, jeers, and a woman's voice, choked but defiant. They reached a clearing near a shack where 6 men stood ringed around a slight figure. A woman in threadbare clothes, her dark hair streaked with snow, her cheeks already bruised purple. She staggered but stood, clutching her arms as if to hold her ribs together. Laughter cut the night open. Arthur stepped from the shadow into the lantern light, his presence stopping the nearest man mid-jeer. "Well, well," one spat. "The hermit's come down. This ain't your business, Graham." "Go back to your hole." Arthur said nothing. He only let the rifle rest easy in his grip, its barrel angled low but steady. His silence carried more weight than shouting. One of the men sneered, "Maybe he wants her, too," and shoved the woman forward so she sprawled in the snow, coughing blood onto the white drift. The girl whimpered from behind a woodpile. Arthur moved then, swift and silent. He swung the butt of his rifle hard into the jaw of the closest brute. The crack of bone snapped through the air, and the man fell like a felled tree. Shouts erupted as the others came at him. He swung again, the rifle stock smashing into ribs. He pivoted, driving his shoulder into another's chest. Fists landed against his back, one catching his temple. He grunted but his grip did not falter. The woman scrambled away, her daughter darting to her side. The fight was ugly and close, breath steaming in the frozen dark. Arthur bled from a cut at his brow, but he stood immovable. When at last the final man staggered back, clutching a broken nose, the others dragged their injured into the dark, spitting curses. "This ain't over," one shouted. "You'll regret crossing us." Silence and the storm remained. Arthur turned, chest heaving. The girl clung to her mother, whispering, "Mama, Mama." The woman tried to rise but swayed. Arthur stepped forward, bent, and without ceremony, lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than she should have been. The girl followed close, a lantern bobbing in her hand, as they left the shack behind. Arthur's boots pressed a new trail into the drifts, leading up and away toward the mountains where his ranch waited. He felt the flutter of the woman's pulse against his neck and heard her soft murmur in a language he did not know. When the cabin's outline finally loomed through the snow, the girl gave a small cry of relief. Arthur pushed the door wide, and warmth spilled from the banked fire inside. He laid the woman gently on the bedstead, pulling coarse blankets over her. The girl dropped the lantern and climbed beside her, stroking her face. Arthur stood a long moment, rifle still in hand, his own blood dripping onto the floorboards. He turned to bar the door, each iron bolt sliding into place with finality. Behind him, the woman whispered in halting English, her voice breaking yet firm, "Why? Help!" He only met her gaze for the first time, seeing not weakness, but a fire banked deep, flickering through the pain. The girl, her eyes wide, whispered once more into the hush, "You'll marry her now, won't you?" Outside, the wind keened against the shutters, but within the cabin, a frail warmth began to gather. The fire had been coaxed higher, its glow throwing long shadows against the timbered walls. Arthur sat near the hearth, the muscles in his arms corded as he worked the edge of a log with his knife. On the narrow bed, the woman, Lena, lay half-raised, her child, Mai, curled at her side in a fitful sleep. Lena's hand trembled where it rested on the blanket, her lips split and bruised. Arthur rose, crossing the room in 3 strides. He set a tin cup on the small table and filled it with hot water from a pot near the fire. He crushed dried herbs between his fingers, letting them fall into the steaming liquid, their scent sharp and earthy. Without a word, he placed it near her hand. She startled at his closeness, dark eyes lifting to his. Slowly, she wrapped her fingers around the cup, sipping the warm liquid and wincing as it touched the cuts in her mouth. Yet she drank because he had offered. Arthur returned to the fire, his face turned toward the flames. The silence was no longer the empty quiet of solitude, but the tentative quiet of strangers forced together. After a time, she spoke, her voice faint but clear. "My name is Lena." Arthur did not answer at once. He leaned forward, feeding a stick to the flames. At last, he said, his own voice rough with disuse, "Arthur." The sound of their names hung in the air, soft but binding. Mai stirred, murmuring in her sleep, and Lena smoothed her daughter's hair, her lips moving in a quiet lullaby. The melody was unlike anything Arthur had heard before, low and lilting, carrying both sorrow and sweetness. He felt the tune thread through him, awakening corners of memory he thought long buried. When the song ended, Lena's gaze drifted to him. "You saved us." He shook his head once. "Men like that don't stop easy. They'll come again." Her jaw tightened. "Then we should go." The suggestion cut into him sharper than he expected. He had lived for years without the weight of others, yet the thought of them stepping back into that storm, back toward a world waiting to break them, filled him with a profound unease. He looked at Mai asleep, then at Lena, her face marred but her gaze steady. He said only, "Not tonight." She studied him for a long breath, and something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement, perhaps, or the first glimmer of reluctant trust. Morning brought a grey light filtering through frost-glazed panes. The storm had settled into a steady, quiet snowfall. Mai woke first, rubbing her eyes. "You're big," she said, looking at Arthur with the open curiosity of a child. He merely lifted a brow as he ladled porridge into 3 bowls. Lena tried to rise and faltered, pain flaring in her ribs. Arthur was beside her instantly, one hand steadying her elbow. She stiffened at his touch, pride flashing in her eyes, but she let him help her sit. They ate in silence, the sound of spoons scraping tin the only measure of time. After the meal, Arthur found Mai's small shoe beside the hearth. Its sole was worn through, the leather flapping loose. Without comment, he set about repairing it with a needle and twine, his large hands moving with surprising care. Mai watched him, a small grin on her face. Lena's eyes softened, but a shadow lingered there. She knew Arthur was right, their safety was temporary. Later that day, a knock rattled the cabin. Arthur's hand went instantly to his rifle. It was a local trapper, his beard crusted with ice. "Words out," the man said. "Those fellas you tangled with are stirring up trouble. Talk of coming back, maybe burning you out." His gaze slid past Arthur, landing on the woman and child inside. "Best be ready." Arthur nodded once and shut the door, the bolt sliding home with a heavy thud. Lena had risen to her feet despite her pain. "They will come," she said quietly. Arthur set the rifle against the wall, his voice even. "Let them." That night, as the snow deepened outside, Lena hummed her lullaby again. When the song faded, she looked toward him in the dim glow. "You should not risk yourself for us." "Why do you?" Arthur lifted his gaze, the firelight catching the scar at his jaw. He did not answer directly, but his silence was an answer in itself, one Lena felt rather than heard. The wind pressed harder at the walls, and for this night, the cabin held. She thought of her daughter's plea, "Marry her, please," and felt the weight of it settle in her chest. In the days that followed, a fragile rhythm formed. Arthur mended tools and set traps. Lena, as her strength returned, tended the fire and swept the floor. Mai sometimes followed him outside, filling the silence with her chatter. Yet beneath the quiet, a sharper tension lurked. Lena flinched at sudden noises, her eyes searching the shadows. One evening, as the storm eased, she finally spoke of her past. "I was 16 when I left Guangdong," she began, her voice low. "My family sold what little we had to send me and my husband here. America promised gold." She drew a shaky breath. "He worked the railroad. Then the mountain took him in a cave-in. They left his body buried under stone." Arthur's jaw tightened. He knew the kind of silence that followed loss. "I washed clothes after that," she continued. "For settlers, for miners. Some spat when they handed me shirts. Some tried to take more than work. When I refused, they spread lies. The beating you saw, it was not the first." She swallowed hard, forcing strength back into her tone. "I told myself to endure." For her she touched my sleeping cheek. Arthur watched the small, tender gesture. He thought of his own wife and son, taken by fever in one cruel week. He had not spoken their names aloud in years, but in the hush after Lena's words, their memory pressed close. "You fought," he said at last, his voice gravelly. "That matters." She looked at him then, truly looked, and saw in his scarred features a grief that mirrored her own. They were no longer just strangers bound by survival, but two souls who recognized the same hollow places in one another. The next day, Arthur rode into town for supplies, leaving them at the ranch. In town, he felt the eyes on him. Men leaned against posts, spitting into the snow as he passed. One muttered loud enough to hear, "Hermit thinks he can keep her. He'll learn." Arthur ignored them, bartering for flour, salt, and ammunition. His silence was its own warning, but he knew words spoken in the dark could gather like wolves. By the time he rode back, dusk had settled. The smoke from his chimney was a welcome sight. Inside, he found Lena tending the fire, her daughter humming softly. The cabin smelled of broth. She turned as he entered, and for the first time, he saw the faintest lift of a smile touch her mouth. Not joy, but gratitude. It was enough to mark the cabin as something more than a shelter. It was the beginning of a home. That night, as Arthur worked oil into the stock of his rifle, Lena sat across from him. "They hate what they do not understand," she said. "They fear what is different. You risk yourself for us." "Why?" He lifted his eyes from his work. "Lost my family," he said simply. "I know what it is to stand alone." Her breath caught at the plainness of it. No grand speech, just the truth. She nodded, and in that nod, something inside her yielded, a piece of her burden loosening. But peace was brief. The following afternoon, two riders thundered past on the ridge. "Enjoy your China, woman, Graham," one shouted down. "You'll pay for stealin's what ain't yours." They spurred their horses and vanished. Lena stood in the doorway, Mai clutching her skirts. Arthur looked from them to the ridge. It was not a matter of if they would come, but when. He began his preparations, securing shutters, checking the axes, and stacking wood higher against the walls. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had lived through an ambush before. A few days later, the trapper returned. "They're gathering," he said bluntly. "Heard 'em in town." Talk of march-ins up here. Some want fire, some want blood. I'd say you've got a day, maybe 2 inch. He tipped his hat and rode off, his words hanging heavy in the winter air. That night, the lullaby Li Na hummed trembled on her lips. When she finished, Arthur looked at her. You should know, he said, his voice low. Once they come, there won't be any turning back. Her throat tightened. Then we fight. The words surprised her even as she spoke them, but once free, they steadied her spine. Snow began to fall again, and in the distance, the wind carried the faint sound of voices. Arthur stood, every line of his body tense. In the dark, men were already moving. The night broke open with fire. Torches flared against the dark, their orange light flickering across snowdrifts. The sound of a dozen men carried up the slope, boots crunching, voices rough with drink and hate. Inside, Arthur rose, rifle in hand, his face set in stone. Li Na froze, pressed to her skirts. He gave them one look, then unbolted the door and stepped outside. Graham, the leader called, his hat pulled low. You've gone soft, hidden a China woman in your bed. Best hand her over, for we burn you out. Arthur's silence was its own kind of weapon, heavier than any curse. From the doorway, Li Na appeared, her shawl pulled close, her eyes alight with a quiet fire. The leader sneered, raising his torch. See? She don't belong here. Give her back to us, and maybe we let you live. Arthur's voice cut through the wind, low and gravelly. No. The single word cracked the night like a shot. Rage erupted. A man surged forward, and Arthur fired. The rifle's crack split the storm, and the man's torch fell hissing into the snow. Chaos followed. Men roared and charged. Arthur dropped his rifle, swinging the butt into one man's jaw, then pivoting to slam his shoulder into another. Snow churned under boots, blood-speckled white drifts. From the doorway, Li Na watched with fierce resolve. When one man broke past Arthur, she seized an iron pot from the fire and flung its boiling contents into his face. He screamed, clawing at his eyes. Arthur fought like a man with nothing left to lose, but there were too many. His breath came ragged, blood dripping from a gash at his temple. He felt the weight of them like a tide, threatening to swallow him whole. Then, the mountain itself gave its answer. The snow that had hung heavy all week groaned from above. A crack echoed across the ridge, and the world vanished into a roaring, thundering avalanche of ice and snow. The white fury tore down the slope, swallowing torches, men, and shouts. Arthur grabbed a cabin post, bracing himself as the edge of the slide rushed past. The settlers' screams were cut short by the roar as the earth trembled, burying everything in its path. In moments, it was over. A deep, suffocating silence returned. The clearing was altered, half the men gone under the mountain's weight. The rest fled into the night. Arthur straightened slowly, chest heaving. He was blooded and torn, but he still stood. He turned toward the cabin where Li Na was clutching her daughter, relief breaking across her features. She stepped forward and knelt beside him, her trembling hands reaching to touch the cut on his brow. Her fingers were gentle as she wiped the blood away. They will not come again, she whispered, her voice raw but certain. For years, Arthur had lived without purpose, locked in grief. Tonight, in her eyes, he saw not weakness, but fire. The girl, slipped from her mother's arms and clutched his coat. You saved Mama. You saved us, she said, her eyes shining. Now you'll marry her? Won't you? The question struck again, small yet piercing. Li Na froze, but Arthur did not move away. His gaze stayed fixed on hers, steady and searching. Dawn broke slow and pale over the snow-laden ridge. Arthur stood with Li Na at the edge of the clearing, the child between them. Take my name, he said, his voice rough. You'll be safe here. It was not romance or poetry, but a shield and a promise, carved from a man who spoke with deeds, not flourishes. Tears welled in Li Na's eyes, slipping silently down her cheeks. She nodded once, sharp and certain. Arthur placed his broad hand gently over hers. His scarred fingers dwarfed her own, but the weight was not heavy. It was steady. Above them, the sun broke through the clouds, gilding the snow with light. The cabin was no longer a hermit's refuge, it was a home, hard won and fragile, but real. The mountain had taken lives, but tonight it had given something back. Mai, caught between them, whispered with the final certainty of a child who believes what they see. "Now we're a family." The words lingered in the cold air, fragile and luminous. The cruelty of men had come with fire and hatred, but the mountain had answered with fury. What remained now was silence, broken only by the crackle of fire within and the faint hum of a lullaby from Liane's lips. For the first time in years, Arthur felt the weight on his chest ease, replaced not by joy, not yet, but by something steady, belonging. The world was still cruel, still vast and dangerous. But here, in this cabin, on this mountain, they had carved out a space that cruelty could not claim.